So if you've been involved in the writing community for a while, particularly online in places like YouTube or other social media, you've probably seen that a lot of people offer writing advice, which makes sense, right? Because we're all looking for ways to become better writers. But writing advice can be really damaging, and that's why I'm not going to offer you any. Hello, Void. My name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author and fiction editor, and welcome to Conversations with the Void, the series where we talk about the joys and frustrations of the creative life, because when all else fails, it helps to think that the void is listening. And speaking of joys and frustrations, today I want to talk about why this is not a writing advice channel. Let's start, as we so often do, with a definition, this time of the word advice. According to Merriam-Webster, advice is a noun meaning recommendation regarding a decision or course of conduct. So there are a couple of ways this pans out when we're talking about writing advice. Types of writing advice. One type of writing advice tends to be the big picture, kind of generic advice about how to be a writer, or what it means to be a writer. So this might be something like a writer is a person who writes, or a writer needs to be an avid reader. And then there's specific writing advice, which tends to be these long lists of filter words to avoid, or top 10 ways to write characters your readers will love. And finally, there's the kind of advice that's a little bit more from the trenches. So maybe someone who has achieved a certain level of success and made a lot of missteps along the way, giving some sort of advice based on the ways they messed up so that maybe you will not mess up. And there's probably other kinds of advice as well, but those were the ones I could think of. So what's your beef with advice? So I don't think advice is necessarily bad. I think it's a way for us to connect as a community and help each other through the difficulties and kind of share our experiences. And I would be a total hypocrite if I didn't mention that I also have a series of videos here on YouTube called Editing Advice for Writers. The difference with that particular series is that it's less about giving advice about how to edit and more about sort of demystifying the editing process and what it's like to work with a professional editor. But arguably, it's still advice. So yeah, the issue isn't necessarily the advice itself, it's the damage that that advice can cause based on who's giving it and how it's being received. I think it's a little bit less common nowadays to get that really restrictive writing advice, like this is the way you need to do it or else, or this is the way a real writer does it, and if you don't do it that way, then you're not a real writer. I think there's a little bit less of that now, although it does still exist, and of course, as you might expect, it's very detrimental to your health as a creative person. But the difficulty with that kind of advice is I feel like it often hits people who are a little bit newer to the writing process, and so when you see that kind of restrictive writing advice, you think, ooh, I better be doing it this particular way, and any other way is wrong. And the problem with that, of course, is that writing, like any creative pursuit, is incredibly subjective. So if you start out by thinking things need to happen in a very specific way, and that happens to not be the way that you work, you can get really discouraged. I mean, think about it. If your favorite writer told you that they always write in the morning and it's the only way they ever get anything done, and really it's the only way anyone could ever get something done, but you're not a morning person, but you still want to write, that can be a big conflict. The difficulty with this kind of advice, and with a lot of different kinds of advice, is it's not really framed as a conversation. It's framed as, this is a person who is the professional, they are the one who knows what they're talking about, and your job is to listen to what they have to say and do what they have to say. And that can be really damaging. Even if someone is not trying to come across in that way, they still might cause some issues because of the sort of hero worship and the idea that you want to be a lot like the people you admire. And so while they may not be trying to tell you the way that you have to do things, you may feel like you have to because here's this successful person you admire who is doing things a certain way. A learning experience. So I feel like the frustrations with restrictive advice are pretty common. That's something you see a lot of folks talking about in various writing and other creative communities. The thing that I don't see people talking about as much that I think we should be is the fact that not everyone learns well from advice. So for example, I've been to many writing conferences over the years, and one of the really common offerings at a conference is the idea that you can sit down in a classroom with a really big name writer and they will talk to you about some element of writing. And sometimes you can ask a few questions at the end if you can manage to reach the person, but basically this is a very sort of passive situation. You are listening to them pontificate on whatever the topic is. And sometimes that information is really helpful. I don't mean to imply that it's not. But again, as I say, it's a very passive situation. And because this is a big name person teaching this class or whatever it may be, they probably don't have time to directly deal with your particular situation and your habits as a writer. And the same could be said of reading a list of 25 filter words not to use, or watching a YouTube video of top 10 things to avoid when writing characters, or whatever the case may be. It's not necessarily specific to your situation. It's kind of broad advice that may or may not be relevant to you and what you're doing. And it's on you to determine if this is relevant to your situation and if and how you want to implement it. I actually think, at least for me, that there is a much better way to learn about writing, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Advice gone wrong. There's also the situation where the advice might just be wrong. For example, when I was in 6th grade and I was first starting to think about the possibility of writing professionally, I was really, really excited to find that one of my favorite authors at the time had written a book about writing. I'm pretty sure there were useful things in that book, but the one thing I definitely remember was a passage where this author talked about writing science fiction and said, if you are going to write in this genre, you need to be prepared for the fact that you will never write in any other genre for the rest of your career. They described it as living in a cage, and it's a gilded cage, and you'll get used to it over time. And 6th grade me was reading this thinking, geez, like I better be really careful about what I decide to pursue as a professional writer, because if I'm not certain, and if I ever think I might want to write in another genre, there's no way to do that, because this person I really admire just said that there is no way to do this. So this information is completely wrong. This is why pen names exist. I'm pretty sure there are people writing across genres even without pen names. And actually, this particular writer wasn't even taking their own situation into account. This is someone who was very well known in the science fiction and fantasy communities, but they were also obviously writing nonfiction about the writing process. They were, I believe, blogging. And even within the fantasy and science fiction area, they were writing across a bunch of subgenres. So this author was giving this advice that they were not even following themselves. And when you are an impressionable writer who is just kind of getting started, this kind of wrong advice can have a huge impact on you. Which leads me to my next point. The person giving this advice is a hypocrite. So this is something I'd be really curious to get your thoughts on, because it seems like a really big topic of conversation in the online writing community. So here's the scenario. Let's say that you are following a big name person on AuthorTube and they give out a lot of really great advice, and then they release a novel. And so you're really excited and you go to check out the novel and you see that the advice that they were giving on their channel is not advice that they followed in their own writing. So what do you do now? The thing that I find so intriguing about this particular element of advice is that if you actually go to Amazon and look at some of the reviews for these books by big-time YouTubers, even the ones where people were disappointed or didn't really care much for the book, or even flat out say, hey, this person gave this advice and then didn't follow it, a lot of them still say, yeah, I was disappointed, but you know what? I'm still going to follow this person on YouTube. I still think they're a lot of fun. I still think they have really interesting things to say. Maybe the next book will be better. Which is not to say there aren't still people who are angry and frustrated and betrayed. This is the internet, after all. And so what do you do with that emotion? I think this is one of those things that really depends on the individual. I find that if I'm still getting something good out of the person's YouTube channel or blog or whatever it may be, if I'm still having a good time and feel like I'm coming away with something interesting to think about, In that case, the quality of the book wouldn't matter as much to me because I would be more invested in the other source of content and supporting the person in other ways rather than with their fiction. On the other hand, if I'm reading a book by an editor about editing where the author is giving other people a hard time for having books with typos and errors and other things, and yet this author's book is full of typos and errors and other things, at that point, the hypocrisy level is a little bit too much for me, and I would probably give up supporting that person. But I do think it depends on you and the value you think you're getting from the advice. We all have different tolerance levels in this area. Advice-free learning. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, I personally have a lot of trouble learning from these sort of more passive kinds of advice. So here's how it works for me in terms of learning about writing. First step, write something. There's really no better way to learn how to write than to be writing something. Step 2, read something. Hopefully something you enjoy, something in your genre maybe. Step 3, think about what you read. So this is the step where the learning actually happens because you have to actually articulate your thoughts about what you read. So not just, ooh, I liked this thing or I didn't like this thing, but why did you like it and why didn't you like it? And step 4, take what you just learned and write some more. Here's an example of how this might look. So one of my favorite books of all time is The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle, and I could go on at length about all the things I really love about this book. So the best character by far in the book is Schmendrick the Magician. And there's, again, so many reasons why he's a great character. But the main thing that really draws readers to him, or at least what drew me to him, is the conflict of his characters. So here is a guy who wants more than anything in the world to be a really, really great magician. And yet, the one thing he is absolutely phenomenally horrible at is being a magician. And I think a lot of people can relate to this idea of longing to be something or to do something and feeling like that's the one thing that you can't be or do. So what I took away from this character and this reading experience is that I'm drawn to these very deeply emotional psychological conflicts. And also this sort of psychological twist where the reader is expecting one thing but getting something else. So someone who is ostensibly a magician but is actually really bad at magic. So what did I do with this? Well, I wrote a book about an empath, and the twist of this character is that when you think about empathy or empath characters, you normally think of someone who feels other people's emotions and is very insightful and intuitive and cares a lot about other people because they know what other people are going through. However, in the Compound series, Bastian is someone who feels other people's emotions and hates them and is really kind of jaded by the world and hates his own emotions and hates emotions in general. His whole conflict as a character is about trying to avoid emotions and how that affects things when he starts to care about people. The other really important thing about learning writing in this manner is that I think you also have to consider the things that you don't care for in the things that you love. So to go back to The Last Unicorn for a moment, one of the things that I didn't think worked so well in the book was a couple of incidents where there is some sort of modern element thrown into this ostensibly high fantasy situation. I'm thinking of, for example, a scene where there's a prince who is waiting around for a princess to do something or other, catch the unicorn, I think, and he's sitting there reading a magazine. And in the context of a high fantasy story, that was a little jarring and odd to have this very modern element in this very sort of traditional fantasy settings. So what I learned from that is that you really need to be careful about reader expectations and world building and tone. And those are things that I'll keep in mind in my own writing as I move forward. Conclusion. So I don't think the issue necessarily is the writing advice itself. I think there are more effective ways to learn how to write, and I think there are some potential pitfalls to everyone being so obsessed with the idea of writing advice. I think the key with giving advice and receiving advice is that you have to be really careful that you know how you're going to be able to adapt this advice to your specific situation. So that's enough of me blabbing. I would like to know about your experience with writing advice. Do you find it helpful? Do you find it not so helpful? Let me know in the comments and let's chat. If you enjoyed this video and you would like more on the creative process, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you really can't get enough, I recommend signing up for my author newsletter. I talk a lot more about the creative process and do some book recommendations, early access to YouTube videos, all sorts of good stuff. So more info on that is below as well. That's it for this episode of Conversations with the Void. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.